The countdown showed 17 years remaining. Marcus finally managed to tear his hand away from the pillar, gasping as the flood of information ceased. His suit's systems were flashing warnings about elevated heart rate and stress indicators, but he barely noticed. The weight of what he'd learned pressed down on him like a physical force. 17 years until the Watchers returned to Earth. 17 years to prepare for contact with something so ancient and powerful that entire civilizations had chosen extinction rather than face what was coming. And he was the only one who knew. Marcus looked around at the graveyard of ships, each one representing a species that had made the same discovery he'd just made. Some had tried to fight, their vessels bearing the scars of weapons that had failed to scratch their enemies. Others had tried to hide, but the beacon had already marked their worlds for harvest. All of them had failed. But Marcus was still alive, and his ship, damaged as it was, might still have enough power for one final transmission. If he could get back to the Meridian's edge, if he could boost the signal with the ship's remaining reactor power, he might be able to warn Earth. It would mean certain death. The transmission would drain what little life support he had left. But 17 years might be enough time for humanity to prepare. He began making his way back through the cathedral of dead ships, each step echoing in the vast space like a funeral march. Behind him, the pillar continued to pulse with alien light, its countdown marking the moments until an ancient evil returned to claim the galaxy. Marcus Wolf had come to Cathara 7 to die alone and forgotten. Instead, he had found a secret that could save or damn the entire human race. The question now was whether he would live long enough to do anything about it. Part 2. The Signal. The journey back to the Meridian's edge took Marcus longer than expected. The alien ship's entrance had somehow shifted while he was inside, or perhaps his memory was playing tricks on him, warped by the overwhelming flood of information he'd absorbed from the beacon. The gap in the hull that had seemed so obvious before now appeared to be just another seamless curve of metal, forcing him to search the perimeter for nearly an hour before finding a different opening altogether. By the time he reached his own ship, his suit's air supply was down to 8 hours. The Meridian's edge looked even more pathetic next to the alien vessel's elegant curves, a battered, utilitarian craft that spoke of humanity's crude understanding of space travel. But she was his, and more importantly, she still had power. Marcus squeezed through the damaged airlock and immediately began working on the communications array. His plan was desperate, possibly suicidal, but it was the only chance he had. The ship's main reactor was down to 15% power, barely enough to keep life support running for another day. But if he could reroute all available energy to the communication system and overload the transmitter, he might be able to send a message that would reach the outer colonies. The work was delicate and dangerous. One mistake in the power routing and he'd either blow the transmitter or trigger a reactor cascade that would vaporize him instantly. Marcus worked with the steady precision of a man who had nothing left to lose, his fingers dancing over control surfaces that he knew better than his own heartbeat. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the images the beacon had shown him. The ancient Watchers weren't a single species. They were something far worse, a collective consciousness that had consumed countless civilizations over millions of years, each conquest adding to their knowledge and power. They moved through the galaxy in cycles, seeding beacons like the one on Cathara 7 to identify potential targets, then returning centuries later to harvest what they had found. The technical specifications he'd absorbed showed ships beyond anything in human imagination, vessels the size of moons that could reshape matter at the molecular level, weapons that could ignite stars or snuff them out like candles. But more terrifying than their technology was their patience. They had been waiting for 17,000 years since their last harvest, content to let new civilizations develop and grow strong before returning to add them to the collective. Marcus finished the power routing and moved to the navigation computer. The beacon had given him star charts showing the locations of other harvested worlds, and he now understood the pattern. The Watchers always struck the most advanced civilizations first, eliminating potential threats before moving on to younger species. Humanity was far from the most advanced species in the galaxy, but they were aggressive and adaptable, qualities that the ancient enemy had learned to fear. The communications array came online with a satisfying hum of power. Marcus had managed to boost the signal strength by nearly 300%, enough to reach the relay stations in the Centauri system if he was lucky. The transmission would burn out the entire communications system and drain the reactor dry, leaving him with perhaps an hour of life support, but it would be enough. Marcus began composing his message, choosing each word carefully. He had to strike a balance between urgency and credibility. Too hysterical and they'd dismiss him as suffering from isolation psychosis. Too calm and they might not understand the magnitude of the threat. He included everything: the location of Kithara 7, the beacon, the graveyard of ships, and most importantly, the countdown. 17 years to prepare for contact with an enemy that had been harvesting civilizations since before humanity learned to use tools. 17 years to develop weapons and defenses against technology that made their most advanced systems look like stone knives. It seemed impossible, but Marcus had seen something else in the beacon's data streams. Fragments of information from other species that had tried to fight back. Most had failed, but a few had managed to inflict damage before being consumed. The key was cooperation. Every species that had faced the Watchers alone had been destroyed, but there were records of temporary alliances that had achieved limited success. If humanity could find and contact the other surviving civilizations, the ones who had managed to escape or hide from previous harvests, they might have a chance. Marcus finished his message and prepared to transmit. His finger hovered over the activation control as he considered the weight of what he was about to do. Once he sent this signal, there would be no going back. Humanity would know about the coming threat, but they would also know that their time was limited. Panic might follow, or worse, some might decide that 17 years wasn't enough time to prepare and choose despair instead of resistance. But the alternative was worse. Without warning, humanity would face the Watchers unprepared, and the harvest would be swift and complete. At least this way, they had a chance. Marcus activated the transmitter. The communications array came alive with power, drawing energy from every available system. The lights dimmed as the reactor strained to provide the massive power requirements, and warning alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The transmission burst lasted only 37 seconds, but it was the most important message in human history. When it was over, the Meridian's edge was truly dead. The reactor shut down with a series of mechanical clanks and sighs, taking the life support systems with it. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in a red glow that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of the alien world outside. He had perhaps 2 hours of air left in his suit, maybe 3 if he didn't move around too much. Marcus settled into the pilot's chair and looked out through the cracked viewport at the alien landscape of Kithara 7. In the distance, he could see the massive bulk of the harvester ship, its hull still glowing with patterns of light that defied explanation. Marcus thought about the other explorers who had made the same discovery he had, all those centuries ago. He wondered if they had felt the same mixture of terror and determination that now filled his chest. Probably they had. The beacon had shown him their final messages, transmitted as their own ships died around them. Warnings and pleas and desperate attempts to prepare their people for what was coming. Most of those messages had never reached their intended destinations. The Watchers had learned to monitor and intercept communications, preventing their prey from organizing effective defenses. But a few had gotten through, and Marcus allowed himself to hope that his would be one of them. The suit's air scrubbers were working harder now, the recycling system struggling to process the carbon dioxide he was producing. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to slow his breathing, conserving what little time he had left. He found himself thinking about Earth. Not the Earth he had left behind 2 decades ago, but the Earth that would exist 17 years from now when the Watchers returned. Would they be ready? Would humanity have found a way to fight back against an enemy that had conquered 1,000 worlds? Marcus had included everything he could in his transmission, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. The real work would have to be done by others, scientists, and engineers and military strategists who would have to find solutions to problems that had no apparent answers. The crash captain, Marcus Wolf, had been drifting through the void for 17 days when his proximity alarms finally screamed to life. The battered hull of his exploration vessel, the Meridian's Edge, groaned as he manually adjusted the thruster, controls with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the reactor leak began 3 weeks ago. His ship was dying, and he was dying with it. The planet below appeared on his failing scanner like a bruised jewel against the star-scattered darkness. Kithara 7, according to the corrupted navigation data still flickering on his screens. A dead world, the preliminary surveys had claimed. No atmosphere worth breathing, no signs of life, no reason for anyone to ever set foot on its rust-colored surface. Perfect for a man who had nowhere else to go. Marcus engaged the landing thrusters, praying to whatever gods might listen that his ship had enough power left for one final descent. The Meridian's Edge had served him faithfully for 12 years, of exploration missions beyond the Outer Rim territories. But now her hull was cracked, her engines sputtering, and her life support systems counting down his final hours in steady, merciless beeps. The descent was rougher than he'd hoped. Without proper atmospheric readings, he was flying blind through Kithara 7's thin atmosphere, relying on instruments that flickered between accurate and catastrophically wrong. The ship bucked and rolled as it caught the planet's weak gravitational pull, and Marcus felt his teeth rattle as they broke through a layer of crystalline dust that hung in the upper atmosphere like glittering snow. When the Meridian's Edge finally touched down, it was less of a landing and more of a controlled crash. The impact threw Marcus against his restraints hard enough to crack a rib, and somewhere in the ship's bowels, something important exploded with a sound like thunder. Emergency lights bathed the cramped cockpit in hellish red, and the steady hiss of escaping atmosphere told him everything he needed to know about his chances of leaving this place. Marcus unbuckled himself slowly, wincing at the sharp pain in his side. Through the cracked viewport, he could see an alien landscape stretching away in all directions. Endless plains of rust-red sand broken by towering spires of black stone that reached toward a sky the color of old blood. 2 pale suns hung overhead, like dead eyes, casting everything in a dim, perpetual twilight that made the world look like the inside of a tomb. He activated his environmental suit and ran a quick diagnostic. 12 hours of air, maybe 14 if he didn't exert himself. The suit's recycling systems were functioning, but barely. It would have to be enough. The airlock cycled with a pneumatic wheeze, and Marcus stepped onto the surface of Kithara 7. The gravity was lighter than Earth standard, making each step feel like a small bounce. The ground beneath his boots was hard-packed sand mixed with something that looked like crushed glass, and it crunched with each footfall. In the distance, he could hear something that might have been wind, but the sound was wrong somehow, too rhythmic, too deliberate. Marcus had been walking for perhaps an hour when he saw the first ship. It emerged from behind one of the black stone spires like a metallic ghost, its hull reflecting the pale sunlight in ways that hurt to look at directly. The ship was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Meridian's Edge, and its design was unlike anything in the colonial fleet. Databases, where human vessels were built for function, all sharp angles and practical surfaces, this ship flowed like liquid metal frozen in motion. Its hull was a seamless curve of silver and gold that seemed to shift and change as he watched, patterns of light chasing themselves across its surface in mesmerizing spirals. But it was clearly dead. The ship sat motionless in a crater of its own making, its elegant curves marred by massive tears in the hull. Whatever had brought it down had hit it hard, and hit it long ago. Sand had drifted up against its base in smooth dunes, and the metal showed the pitting and discoloration of centuries of exposure to the alien elements. Marcus approached cautiously, his boots slipping on the loose sand as he climbed the crater's edge. The ship's hull towered above him, and as he drew closer, he could make out details that made his breath catch in his throat. The metal wasn't just reflective, It was alive with patterns that seemed to pulse and flow like circuit boards made of liquid light. Even in death, the alien technology was more advanced than anything humanity had ever conceived. He found an opening near what he assumed was the ship's bow, a triangular gap in the hull that might have been a docking port or might have been battle damage. The edges were smooth and rounded, suggesting it had been formed deliberately rather than torn open by violence. Marcus squeezed through the gap and activated his suit's helmet lights. The interior of the ship defied his expectations. Instead of corridors and compartments, he found himself in a vast cathedral-like space that seemed to extend far beyond what the ship's external dimensions should have allowed. The walls curved upward into darkness, and the floor beneath his feet was made of the same flowing metal as the hull, patterns of dim light threading through it like veins. But it was the other ships that made him stop and stare. They filled the cathedral space like sleeping giants, dozens of vessels of every conceivable design and origin. Marcus recognized a few: the angular bulk of a Terran heavy cruiser, the sleek curves of a Centauri exploration vessel, even what looked like one of the ancient generation ships that had carried the first colonists beyond Earth. But there were others he'd never seen before, ships that belonged to no human design philosophy, their hulls marked with symbols and patterns that belonged to civilizations he'd never heard of. All of them were damaged. All of them were empty. And all of them had been arranged with careful precision around a single point at the center of the vast chamber. Marcus made his way through the graveyard of ships, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The air inside was stale but breathable, another impossibility that he added to the growing list of things that made no sense about this place. As he drew closer to the center of the chamber, he began to make out what the ships were arranged around. It was a pillar of the same flowing metal as everything else. But this pillar was different. It pulsed with internal light, patterns of energy, racing up and down its length in complex cascades that were almost hypnotic to watch. At its base, symbols and glyphs covered every available surface, some carved into the metal, others seeming to float just above the surface like holograms. Marcus had seen similar arrangements before, in the ruins of dead civilizations scattered across the galaxy. They were data repositories, libraries of knowledge left behind by species that had vanished into history. But this one was active, its patterns of light suggesting that whatever information it contained was still accessible. He approached the pillar cautiously, his suit sensors registering energy readings that made no sense. The technology was clearly operational, but it was drawing power from sources his instruments couldn't identify. As he drew closer, the patterns of light seemed to respond to his presence, growing brighter and more complex. When Marcus placed his gloved hand on the pillar's surface, the world exploded into light and sound and sensation that overwhelmed his senses. Images flooded his mind, star charts showing the locations of worlds he'd never heard of, technical schematics for technologies that humanity hadn't even dreamed of, and most importantly, a story that changed everything he thought he knew about. The galaxy. The pillar was a beacon, he realized as the information flowed through his consciousness like a torrent. Not just a library, but a trap. Every ship in this chamber had been drawn here by the same signal that had caught the attention of their respective civilizations. The beacon called to explorers, to those who pushed the boundaries of known space, drawing them to this dead world, with promises of knowledge and discovery. But the knowledge came with a price. Each species that found the beacon learned the same terrible truth, that the galaxy was not as empty as they had believed. There were things in the dark between the stars, ancient things that had been waiting and watching since before the first. Civilizations learned to build fires. The beacon was their creation, a lure designed to identify and catalog every spacefaring species that emerged in this sector of the galaxy. And now they knew about humanity. Marcus tried to pull his hand away from the pillar, but the connection had been established. More information poured into his mind, technical specifications for the ships that surrounded him, star charts showing the locations of their homeworlds, and most terrifyingly, a countdown that had been running for millennia. The ancient watchers were returning, following the beacon's signal back to every world that had sent explorers to find it.